He was a driver that captured my imagination, really, when I first read about him in Competition Car magazine in 1974 in an article written by the great Nigel Roebuck. And I rang Nigel yesterday and said, Nigel, I've got these pictures of Varzi. And he said, really? Where did you find these? I've never seen these. Anything like? Anyway, he was very excited. I said, Nigel, what I'd like to do is paraphrase your article and voice that paraphrasing over these photographs as we run them about Varzi, to tell a little bit of a story about Varzi and who he was. And he said, yeah, delighted. So that's what I've done. And that's the story of what this is. And I should tell you at the end of this, you'll see a painting of Varzi as he was depicted on the front cover of a magazine called El Grafico. And the reason that's there is because right at the end, I point out that Fangio was a massive Varzi fan. They met when Varzi was racing in Argentina, and he persuaded Fangio actually to go to Europe and begin his career in Europe. They were very close, and Fangio was a massive fan, if that's the right word. And it's interesting to see Varzi was on the front cover of El Grafico, which was the biggest sports magazine in Argentina. It was the sort of Sports Illustrated of Argentina. And there he was, I guess in about 1945, 1946, on the front cover of El Grafico. Anyway, this is the voiceover. This is the video I did of this collection of photographs. They're not in any real order that makes sense relative to the narrative. So listen to the narrative independently of looking at the pictures. So enjoy. He was born into a wealthy family near Milan, and his arrival in Grand Prix racing was painless. After a successful motorcycling career, he simply bought himself an Alfa P2 in 1928, which led to a factory drive and many Grand Prix victories for the next couple of seasons. And so began the great rivalry with Tazio Nuvolari, where Nuvolari was an uncomplicated hero of the people, the embodiment of extrovert heroism, the true Italian who talked with his hands and loved children. Varzi was a creature of mystery, uncommunicative and aloof. He dressed elegantly, stayed only in the finest hotels, and certainly did not kiss babies. For all their differences, though, the two men got along well. So long as Nuvolari wasn't around to hear it, Varzi would invariably refer to him as Il Maestro, and their respect for one another was absolute. Take the 1930 Mille Miglia, which in those days was fought over 16 hours and finished in darkness. In the closing stages, Varzi led on the road, but Nuvolari was ahead on time. Then Varzi noticed in his mirrors the headlight pattern of Nuvolari's car. "It's him," he said grimly to his riding mechanic. After a while, Varzi began to hope again. The lights were gone. Was Nuvolari out? He was not. Within 30 miles of the finish, Varzi was jolted by a flash of lights and the blast of a horn. For miles, Nuvolari had been sitting there on Varzi's tail, lights off. Call it respect. Call it faith. Varzi joined Auto Union for 35, and during early tests at Monza, the Saturnine Italian met Ilse, the wife of Paul Pietsch, Auto Union's young reserve driver. Varzi won at Tripoli in 36, as he had in 33 and 34, but was shattered at the prize giving when the governor of Tripoli declared Germany's Hans Stuck to be the moral winner. These were the days of the Rome-Berlin axis and the influence of von Ribbentrop. Varzi hurled his glass to the floor and stalked out, raging. In his room, he found sleep impossible, his mind in turmoil. "Try this," said Ilse. "I often use it when I can't sleep. It helps a lot." In her fingers, she held a syringe. They'd been together a year, but this was the first Varzi knew of her addiction. Hours later, still sleepless, Achille held out his arm for the needle. Had Varzi been an unkempt man, garrulous and undisciplined, the change might have been imperceptible for a while, but in one such as he, the transformation was startling. Morphine isn't kind. Varzi was not seen at the circuits in the very late 1930s, but when racing resumed after the war, he was back with Alfa Romeo once more. He was himself again, free of addiction after months in a home, and was now married to Norma, whom he'd known before the years of tribulation. He regained his former grace. With the great Jean-Pierre Vimille as Varzi's teammate, Alfa dominated the early post-war years. He raced in Argentina and was so captivated by the country that he spoke of retiring there to open a racing school. He also befriended Juan Manuel Fangio and persuaded him to race in Europe. The first Grand Prix of '48 was the Swiss at Bremgarten, and early evening was settling in as Varzi ventured out onto a wet track. The Alfa went into a slide on a fast S-bend, clipped a wooden barrier and somersaulted,
throwing Varzi out onto the road. Varzi, wearing only his white linen helmet, was killed instantly. No one was more upset than Juan Manuel Fangio. Varzi was, to me, a god, he said. He spoke with great simplicity. He gave me precious advice. He's probably the driver I've most admired in my life, a man who cared only for his art.
The life and often sad times of Achille Varzi, one of the greatest racing drivers for sure that we've ever seen. Amazing, some of those photographs. I've never really known how steep the banking was at Nuvolari. Incredible. And also, there's a shot at the start of the race at Carthage, the Tunis Grand Prix, and Varzi's third row, but he won that race from there. Yeah, it just shows they're all human beings. They're all living the lives that we live today. They had their faults, they had their good points, and all the same sorts of things used to happen. And yeah, of course, we see it in black and white, but it was in colour, wasn't it? It was real life back then. I love that shot too of them in their early days when they were in motorcycling, and you see the knee pads on Varzi. Presumably that's because when he's leaning over, he's rubbing his knee on the road, I would guess, because they're not wearing helmets or anything. It wasn't for safety. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. And to me, a lot of thanks should go to Nigel Roebuck there. But and that immortal phrase, morphine isn't kind. I always remember reading that and being completely staggered when it became clear what had been going on. But I should say a big thanks to the suppliers of those photographs, Matteo Colombo, the Meurisse Agency, the Vincenzo Archive, and Tetos da L'Istantanea.